Thank you for joining us for the breakout session this afternoon on technology and the coordination of paratransit and human services transportation. My name is Diane Schwager, and I'm the moderator for this session. And I'm a senior program officer with the Transit Cooperative Research Program, or TCRP. First of all, I'd like to thank SUMSI for converting their summit to a virtual summit so quickly. And I'd like to mention that this session you may enter questions in the Q&A, and the questions will be answered at the end of the session. There are 4 presenters in this session that each have very important and relevant experience, and I will introduce them all in turn before they speak. Before I do so, I'd like to provide you some background on TCRP, which is part of the Transportation Research Board and the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. TCRP is an applied research program that works collaboratively with FTA and the public transportation industry to conduct problem-solving research. I'm not going to discuss any of the specific research reports TCRP has published that are relevant to this session, but I hope you'll take the time to download some of the reports from TRB's website after the summit. My presentation and the others today will be available to you through SUMSI. TCRP has conducted research over the past 26 years that answer many of the big questions relevant to this session. What are the travel needs of people using paratransit and human resources transportation? What transportation services do people really want to use? And how can paratransit services better meet the needs of travelers, both with and without disabilities? How can systems and technologies of on-demand transportation be updated and improved by more efficient, more responsive to customers, and being less costly? How should business and management practices change, possibly in recognition of new modes of travel or to better leverage available sources of revenues? The previous 4 slides presented research TCRP has completed but are relevant to this session. This one presents research that's underway or relevant to some of the other sessions at the summit. SUMSI has conducted a number of TCRP's most popular reports, including most of them listed here on this slide. Now I'd like to introduce the first speaker for this afternoon, Tara Curtis. Tara co-leads Nelson Nygaard's emerging mobility practice, which is committed to putting people first in the era of new mobility. Through past and recent research and work with clients serving people with disabilities, Tara will provide an overview of why customers, transit agencies, and mobility contractors align on desiring change in how we deliver paratransit services. She offers a framework of what and who might drive that change. Tara?
There we go. Thank you, Diane. And I also wanted to thank the Shared Use Mobility Center for all the legwork you've done in pivoting these sessions to virtual meetings. So as Diane mentioned, I co-lead Nelson Nygaard's emerging mobility practice, and I'm based in San Francisco. Part of the lens that I bring to my work in emerging mobility is experience in supporting paratransit projects and other work to deliver specialized transportation services to seniors and people with disabilities. So I wanted to start our session today with some of the perspectives I've gathered through working at the intersection of emerging mobility and paratransit, with a particular focus on the experience of people and customers navigating that system. So when we're talking about the why of changing the way we provide mobility to seniors and people with disabilities, some of our countries most in need, we can think about the motivations of customers, of transit agencies, and of their contracted providers. In a lot of ways, each of these groups is motivated by similar outcomes. A better customer experience is both aligned with transit agency values and is better for business. So I'll take each of these in turn and go a little deeper into the customer, agency, and contractor core interests in seeing change in this market. Among the ADA paratransit customers that we've worked with or had the opportunity to speak with, we see a spectrum of perspectives relating to changing the underlying paratransit service delivery model. Some really want paratransit services to change. They want more flexibility in their lives, and they want the same level of responsiveness customers without specialized mobility needs enjoy on the open market. On the other hand, some are totally against it, and the assurance of a familiar, trained driver or consistent experience outweighs the benefits of potentially quicker response times. Lastly, some just aren't sure. This is possibly the largest group, the sort of interested but concerned group, and I think the private sector is very interested in folks in this group. On the transit agency side, some of the perspective I can offer here is due to an opportunity we had last year to work with TCRP and Diane, researching partnerships between TNCs or transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft and transit agencies. We saw a range of partnership models, most common of which being the first and last mile service for a general public audience. But a close second is partnerships that offer a supplementary same-day mobility option to customers of ADA paratransit. And those represented about 40% of the case studies we reviewed. In in-depth interviews with the managers of those partnerships across the country, paratransit service managers in particular cite key motivations around cost effectiveness and lower cost per trip, increasing mobility for customers, and normalizing their lives. Generally, like the supplemental taxi programs for same-day transportation that have existed for a long time, we see lower cost per trip, but in net minimal overall cost savings due to more trip making. And lastly, the private sector perspective, there are several motivators for increased investment in serving customers with specialized mobility needs. One of them being relative newcomers to this space sense a lack of response and innovation from incumbent contractors, and also see a welling interest in their customer base, meaning the transit agencies, in exploring new ways of delivering service. They also see a big market and a growing one with an aging population and a high reliance on contracted service already within the paratransit industry in this country. And they know that customers want a same-day option. So all these motivations and interests in change are interesting to think about, and it's nice to see that there is a fair amount of alignment across customer and public and private perspectives. But the question of how to leverage that alignment and importantly work through areas of misalignment is really how change is made. So I'll offer some initial thoughts on this question of how to bring about change, but these are sort of high-level thoughts, and I think the other presenters that follow me will go into more depth into some of the paths that they're actively working on that get to a deeper level of specificity. So one way to change is through pilots and sort of a recognition that projects serve, or pilot projects serve a critical function as drivers of change. I'll move quickly through these items, but when you think about what makes a good pilot, it's one that is designed from the beginning to test, learn, and continually improve. So by starting with the definition of the problem, thinking about what problem you're trying to solve and defining the specific parameters on who is the target market, what is the use case they're going to be using it for, and importantly, an intentional and focused evaluation that enables iteration and continual improvement. Then you start to enable real learning and change. So I'll just make a quick note here that one of the chapters in the TCRP report 204 that I referenced before is specific to this partnership pilot model. There's a partnership playbook in there that's a brief step-by-step suggested approach to bringing about to trying to solve problems sort of iteratively. But beyond pilots, I think a second way that change is coming to paratransit is through an industry-wide trend toward mobility management. And now, more than ever, there's a need to do more with less. And in the context of COVID-19, we see paratransit services across the country in cities large and small pivoting quickly to provide safer mobility to customers, but also new services like meal delivery and keeping connections to the community. We're in a period of sort of forced experimentation right now, expanding what paratransit services can do with the resources available. And I think it remains to be seen if and how this experimentation can advance the way we think about paratransit today. Lastly, we see a lot of interest from the private sector in delivering paratransit type services differently. Within the last year or two, both Uber and Lyft started offering wheelchair accessible vehicle services with a promise of 15-minute or less response times in select markets across the country, in partnership with more traditional contractors like MV Transportation or First Transit. So that's one way that they're exploring this market. Another is that we do see a lot of activity and interest among transit agencies across the country in partnering with companies like Uber and Lyft to supplement a core paratransit service offering. And I think you'll hear more from Diogo specifically on an example of that. And then lastly, we see new players with newer dispatching software starting to win contracts with paratransit services with a vision to start blurring the lines between general public and traditional paratransit service. So I'll end there by just summarizing that I think we see a lot of interest and momentum in the direction of changing the way we serve people with disabilities and provide mobility for them. And to realize that vision, I think we need to enable experimentation and measured risk-taking in the paratransit industry and take advantage of the areas of both public and private alignment. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. Our next speaker is Roger Teal. And based on decades of research and experience with the institutional, operational, and technology aspects of demand responsive transportation, including 3 major in-progress projects, Roger will suggest approaches that are best implemented via technology-enabled mechanisms for substantially improving the performance of ADA paratransit and human services transportation. Roger?
Okay, now if I can just figure out how to get this onto my screen, that will, let's see here. Okay. Yeah, interesting. Okay, speaker view, let's see, share screen, and share, here we go. Okay. Okay, Diane, can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you, Diane, and thank you, Tara, for that excellent presentation. It's definitely a bit of a lead-in to what I'm going to be talking about here. So demand response for transportation is the foundation for the two types of services for individuals whose circumstances are such that they aren't able to regularly use public transportation. One of these services, of course, is what Tara was talking about, ADA Paratransit. The other is human services transportation, which are services focused on agency clients who, for at least some of their trips, lack other transportation options in the agency's own service. The current situation for both of these types of services is problematic, although in different ways. And this is not a new situation. These problems have been present literally for decades. Fortunately, and again, Tara has alluded to this, we're now at a point, I think, where we have some strong reasons to believe that major improvements in outcomes are possible for both of these problematic situations. And effective approaches to achieving these improved outcomes, approaches which involve both service organization concepts and technology, are what I'll be discussing in my presentation. So first, let's talk about ADA Paratransit. What's the problem? And the problem, is really, the first item there is really the crux of the problem. Transit agencies are spending an extraordinarily large amount of money, a portion of their budget, for a very, very small number of trips for ADA Paratransit. When I show these numbers to people at first, they, wow, I can't believe it. And I say, well, look up the data in the transit database, and they're sort of shocked. Something on the order of 15 to 20% of most transit agencies' budgets for medium-large transit agencies are now going to ADA Paratransit, which constitutes 1 to 2% of their total trips. So, and this is largely, more than largely, almost exclusively a consequence of the low productivity of dedicated vehicle types of services. Now, you would think for all that money that we would be getting a good level of customer service, but in fact we aren't. The service we provide to customers is, I would contend, mediocre or worse. One-day advance notice is certainly a burden for many customers. The quality of the service is often inconsistent. And as Tara said, many people who have come to rely upon that find the service familiar. They don't have large demands on the service. They're happy to get any sort of transportation because they literally had no options before. But it's clearly not of the same quality of the transportation services for those of us who are more in the mainstream of local transportation would expect. So what's the real problem here? And the real problem here is that dedicated vehicle operations, which are the mainstay for ADA Paratransit, are hopelessly unproductive. At the first international conference on paratransit back in October of 2014, which a couple of people on this panel besides myself were at, Nigel Wilson, who's sort of the father of demand responsive transportation, got up and made the statement, it's the demand density, stupid. And that's really the case for ADA Paratransit. Demand density is far, far too low to make for productive regional scale services. And I'll show you some graphics in just a moment that I think will drive that home. Because the demand density is so low, it severely limits the amount of shared riding that can occur. Typically, as little as 25% of the vehicle time is shared. And in some services, it's even less than that. And that's exacerbated by the long trips, typically 6, 7, 8 miles average trip lengths, 2.5, 3, even more times longer than for a general public demand responsive services. So let's take the Nashville Metropolitan Transportation Agency, which is one of our clients that I've been working with for the last couple of years, as an example. 2 million population, not a small city. 450 square mile service area for the ADA Paratransit. About 1,300 passengers a day. Trip length about 7 miles. The demand density for the peak period is about 0.2 trips per square mile per hour. And that's how you measure demand density, the number of trip demands per square mile per hour. to get effective shared ride services, you typically need about 2 to 3 trips per square mile per hour. And that won't get you high productivity, but it'll get you something decent. 5 trips per square mile per hour, you're starting to do well. So here we're looking at an order of magnitude less productivity than you would need for effective shared ride service. Not surprisingly, the overall service productivity is low, but this is not untypical for ADA paratransit. It's actually in sort of the realm of the norm, if you will, for ADA paratransit. Now, interestingly, they've already taken 22% of all their trips and diverted them to the local taxi company and some other providers now. So some of the worst trips have already been pushed out, over to other providers. And that's by policy, and they've been doing that for 15 years. So it's not that they're handling all the trips that are difficult, but the last factoid here really makes the point. 1/4 to 1/3 of their service has nobody on the vehicle, and about 70% either has nobody or one person on the vehicle. So only about 30% of the time are the vehicles traveling with more than one person. So that's unproductive service. So let's take a look at it visually. On the right-hand side, we have 2 vehicle runs here. On the right-hand side, you see an actual run from the ADA paratransit service. This run went across 140 square miles, which is not that unusual for some of their runs. It handled 8 trips in 8 hours, and the black lines are the parts of the route where there was nobody on board, just the driver. Most of the time you can see there's just 0 or 1 person. I think there's one point where there is 2 or 3 people, a different color of blue. And so it's running over a substantial part of Nashville. On the left-hand side, we took the trips, the actual trips that occurred in a much smaller part of Nashville, and we doubled the number of trips that were in that service area and said, well, then let's see what happens if we just took those trips in this service area and scheduled them in our general public demand responsive service. That's a 11 square mile service area. We got 14 trips and 4 vehicle hours, still not very good productivity, average trip length 2.2 miles. You can see the difference. So now what I did here on this next slide is I superimposed the small service area, which is west of downtown. It's not in the downtown, it's just west of it, onto the large regional map. And you can see it's much, much smaller, but it has actually more trips in it in a much smaller part of the day than the ADA paratransit. We're talking about 2 different types of service totally. The left-hand side service, that's a shared ride, demand responsive service. The right side of service is essentially taxi cab service. Unfortunately, we're trying to provide what is, in essence, from results perspective, taxi cab service with a model that's not designed for taxi cab service. So the challenge is, how can we move away in a substantial way from that model to something that will create more cost effectiveness? Now, places like Chicago and Nashville are already doing this by consciously diverting some of their regular trips, a non-trivial number of regular trips, to taxis or non-dedicated vehicles. And they've been doing this for a couple years in Chicago and many years in Nashville. And Chicago is continuing to drive that number up towards 15 to 20% over the next year or 2. And the savings on the order of 10 to 40 or even 50% per diverted trip. So that's a conscious approach to not use consumer choice, but simply to say we will segment our trips into two buckets, one to be handled by non-dedicated vehicles, the other by dedicated vehicles. But now there's also overlaid on that the consumer choice approaches, which Nygaard will talk about for the MBTA, but we've seen other places go all in on this. Las Vegas, for example, Pinellas County, and places like Denver and the city of Chicago have had such consumer choice service approaches in place for years. As a matter of fact, Nashville and Chicago have both. So the consumer choice approaches are totally consistent with the major shift towards non-dedicated vehicles, the sort of thing that Tara was suggesting may be in the offing in the relatively near future. And they also, of course, address the level of service issue, because this is a service that's much more akin to the regular what consumers are using. Many technology approaches can be used for these consumer choice options, various front-end systems to control usage, a whole host of examples to be able to do that. And Nygaard, again, will talk in more depth about the MBTA situation, which I think all of us see as sort of the really intriguing case study of this. But typically when these are done, large numbers of people take advantage of the consumer choice services. In Nashville, in the first 9 months after this was implemented about a year and a half ago, 18% of the riders had used it at least once. So there's technology to do this. And again, I hate to keep referencing Nygaard. He's going to talk about some of the technology, but the key technology is to be able to, on the front end, allocate trips between the non-dedicated vehicles, whether taxis, TNCs, or other types of operators, and the dedicated vehicles. You have to identify in some way which trips are most likely to be high cost if they're on the dedicated vehicles, and try to allocate as many of those as you can to non-dedicated vehicles, taking into account the realistic capacity of the non-dedicated vehicle providers and all these other things. Wheelchair trips, again, can be allocated as capacity is available. There's obviously limitations on that from third-party providers. Many levels of sophistication can be seen to do it. Many of these providers now have their own software system, whether it's a taxi company or an Uber, Lyft, or another TNC. So your system then can, via API, send these trips directly to them. You never schedule them in your own service, in your own system. So the technology exists to do that. And we're now starting to see organizations testing the waters on this. Okay, that's ADA paratransit. Human service transportation is very, very different animal, but yet it also is well situated to take advantage of the technology of the time. The problem in human service transportation is a lack of resources, insufficient financial resources, organizational capacity is often very limited. You have outdated software systems or internal technology system. Limited use of technology for customer interaction. And for the last 30 years, the story has been the same. These organizations have a very difficult time to provide simply okay service, not excellent service, just to provide basic okay service. They can't do that a lot of the time. Now, we've been talking about coordination in human service transportation for that same 30-year period. And as from my perspective, it's largely empty talk. Coordination is not an end in itself. It's only a means to an end. And I continually make this point to people. The business sector doesn't coordinate. It transacts. Yes, we do have lots of coordination in business today, but it's accomplished by technology systems, software systems that transact across boundaries in pursuit of inter-organizational agreements. Think of whatever you ordered from Amazon the last time, if it was from a third-party provider of that service, all the coordination that took to get it from that organization's warehouse to your table, to your dining room table. A lot of coordination, but these organizations don't think of it as coordination. They think of it as transactions. And this is where human service transportation is still sort of stuck back in the 1980s, is they've never made the leap to sort of technology-driven business. So the real challenge then in human service transportation is concerting all these resources across different organizations and different service providers, because right now it's all very much siloized among the service organizers, the funders, the providers, the trip makers. And there is no system today that allows those resources to be easily connected together to provide transportation to people. So this is really the challenge. How do we concert resources? So what we need is a digital platform that will enable whatever service organization approach makes sense to your region. I'm going to talk about 3 of them in just a moment here. And these are the sorts of things that platform has to be able to support. It has to be able to support comprehensiveness. It has to be able to combine resources. It has to support the whole trip life cycles, booking, scheduling, execution, etc. It has to be able to have some level of personalization. It has to all these back-end connections, all the things that get that whatever you bought from Amazon, from that small company in Indiana's warehouse to your dining room table, all that has to be in place here to make that happen. So here's the 3 types of service systems that we see out there in the real world. Not very many examples, but here's what we have. One is what we call one-click. And here the idea is we have a single portal into the world of human service transportation. It doesn't have to be just human service, but we're just using that as the example here. And there's something there that takes that Roger Teal logs in and he makes a trip request, and it knows that Roger Teal's trip request needs to go to provider system B, as you see in this scheme. And that identity and routing engine does that, and it sends it to provider system B, and Roger gets a trip as a result. So there could only be one system back there, and they may only be one, or there could be multiple. So here, what I call it's mediated transactions, because that which is in the middle is the mediator to get you to the right place. We see a few examples of this. Cambridge Systematics has developed this one-click software system. It's operational in Jacksonville, Florida, and in some places in Pennsylvania. So, I mean, we have real-life examples of that, and we hear more and more people talking about this one-click approach. Another possibility is what I call loose provider coupling. In this case, which is, and I give the example of a trip exchange or clearinghouse. Each agency does its own thing, but now if you have excess capacity, you can take trips. If you have trips that you can't handle, you can put them into the clearinghouse. So now everybody is connected into the clearinghouse. We have a system like this in Denver. It's right now, it only has the basic functionality. It's going to become much more functional over the next 6 months. Multiple organizations are involved with it. And by the way, this is publicly available software. It was developed as part of an MSAA project. So it's not open source per se, but anybody who wants it can have it. And the third model here is what I'll call federated integration. This is end-to-end transactional systems. What's the big thing here is what I'll call the service provider allocation, scheduling, and management engine. We have multiple ordering systems. We have multiple providers behind the scene, and this system in the middle pulls all of it together. Very sophisticated, very comprehensive. And for those of you who are familiar with it, not surprisingly, the example here is Flex Denmark, the largest DRT system in the world, up to 20,000 trips a day, 500 service providers, 350 funding agencies, an enormous accomplishment, services for a variety of different types of organization. But the key thing, and this all grew incrementally, was the digital platform. So this is, again, all these human service transportation operations need a digital platform to be able to make these things happen. So I'll stop there and turn it over next to Diogo.
Okay, thank you, Roger. Our next speaker is Diogo Lusa. And Diogo is the Director of Paratransit Technology for MBTA in Boston and co-founder of Dynamic Ideas Routing. He's managed MBTA's paratransit pilot with Uber and Lyft, led procurement and implementation of new paratransit software, as well as research efforts with universities such as Harvard and MIT. Diogo will provide an overview of MBTA's program evolution over 3 years, utilizing TNCs as partners in paratransit, some breakthroughs in routing optimization, and results from current research effort that evaluates equity in paratransit system with multiple modes of transportation. So thank you, Diogo.
Thank you, Diane, and really appreciate, hello everyone. I would like to thank the Shared Use Mobility Center for the opportunity to join this great group of panelists and discuss this important topic. It's a pleasure to participate here at the Shared Use Mobility Summit. My name is Diogo Loza, and as Diane said, I will talk about the intermodal optimization in paratransit, but some of these learnings may also apply to human service and also mobility as a service. So as a summary here of this presentation, I'll cover an overview of the MBTA, the ride operation with a perspective of integrated service and with the lens of the on-demand pilot. And I will also cover a summary of what we believe is the intermodal future and some of its challenges. So I'll start with the riderships and costs for the ride. So on-demand pilots started in October of 2016. We started with 400 customers back then, and then since then has become a very valuable value option for our customers. It has over 4.5 thousand customers sign up now and has served all the 63 cities and towns in the ride service area. It has delivered over 500,000 trips by now, and I want to highlight the growth of the program as well. So it took us 6 months to achieve 10,000 trips. Then it took us 18 months to reach 100,000 trips, and then it took us 37 months to achieve 400,000 trips. So the pilot now represents 16%, as Roger mentioned, in a lot of this model, like the growth, and this has been around for a while, but I think we have a different approach now, as everyone mentioned, regarding the technology. So 16% of all paratransit trips now occur on non-dedicated service at the MBTA, and it's becoming a bigger share of the paratransit trips. Trips overall, combining the two services, are stable with a small decrease on the dedicated service and a massive increase in the mobility for the non-dedicated customer service. So also, the non-dedicated service provider has helped control overall cost per trips increase, as Roger mentioned, and this is our experience here. So even as a small portion of all paratransit trips, the pilot has helped the ride control the service while significantly increased mobility for a portion of its customers. Dedicated service costs are up by 5%, while the combined overall trip cost is only up by 1%. So this highlights how this non-dedicated service can also play a role in relieving a little bit of the challenge of the funds, as Roger pointed out in his presentation. So here is some of the numbers from the pilot. On the cost per trip base, pilot trip is over 60% lower than a traditional paratransit trip, allowing us to provide over 50% more mobility to this group of customers. while maintaining a 2% on overall cost of the system, a reduction 3% in the overall cost of the system for this entire group. So this is kind of the new equation now, how the things balance now. So you're really looking at your average cost per trip going down so that you could provide more mobility with the same or lower overall cost. So this is kind of what we believe is kind of the future model now. You're going away from the one mode of transportation and blending those modes into a way that you can serve the population better, and you're really looking to be more efficient there. So with that, I'll talk about our work to fully integrate this non-dedicated service into our optimization algorithms and for an entire city or region, and analyze equity in these systems. As Roger mentioned, the challenge there between selecting which trips should go to which mode, that's really what we explore there. And then when you apply that, how does that play out? And then this work is done in partnership with Steve Moore from HBS and Julia Young from MIT. So the past 3 years, I have been heavily involved in the research efforts to design and evaluate full intermodal options, like Diane mentioned. And most of the findings that I'll talk about today will be from this recent paper that's under review now, that's creating mobility equity for paratransit customers through intermodal operating systems. So following those lines and working with this for a long time, we found the lack of a product. So that's why in 2020 I teamed up with Professor Dimitris Persimas from and co-founded from MIT and co-founded Dynamic Ideas Routing. So we're part of the Dynamic Ideas group that has over 20 years providing technology solutions to industries such as finance, supply chain, and others. And at Dynamic Ideas Routing, we're really focused on solutions for complex transportation systems such as school transportation and modern transit, including paratransit. So we bring a complete analytical approach to this type of operation, really leveraging the technology that everybody's mentioning, creating some of this most advanced technology to be deployed in this systems. So our technology is powered by the next generation of routing algorithms as we see it. So we go beyond analyzing a single request or a single transaction as Roger was mentioning, to a more general approach to analyze all requests at the same time. So it's really looking at the entire demand that you have at that hour or that day, and find first we connect all the requests into pools or sequences of pickups and drop-offs. So really creating groups of trips that make sense to work together or to travel together. And then secondly, we connect those pools into drivers' itineraries, satisfying all labor constraints. So this is where, like a lot of, we're taking into account unions and some of these others, union rules and some others rules that are local to each scenario there. So, and we don't stop there. Like on top of that, based on the customer eligibility, we analyze that if that request should be served by a dedicated service or outsource it to other service, non-dedicated, such as Uber, Lyft, taxis, or other service that they have available. So this provides maximum efficiency for your fleet while providing greater customer service too. So this is really tackling the challenge that Roger mentioned, that you'd have a very different trips inside the systems, being human service systems or paratransit system. You have groups of trips that are efficient and can be combined into a greater ride sharing, and you have really trips that are meant to be served by a taxi due to their deadhead and some others. And the new approach here is because of the presence of Uber and Lyft and some others in the region, that factor of deadheading is greatly reduced because of the amount of vehicles they have on the road. So we're utilizing this technology, we apply the optimization to the entire MBTA customer base and evaluate equity for the service equity using the STEPS methodology from the shared mobility and transportation equity studies. So we focus on two questions here. First, can the customer access the NDSP service? And then, does software optimization drives inequality? In this presentation, I'll talk about the second question, and we'll focus on the spatial distribution. So mainly we're looking at if this routing optimization, also the other element that we have there is looking in cancellation, the predicting the cancellations and no-shows, how does that impact the equity of the service? So as expected, when we apply this to an entire region or to an entire city as MBTA, because of the different trip densities, naturally you get, in order to achieve the optimal solution from an efficiency perspective, the optimization engine serves customer differently. So depending on where you live or the type of your trip or the nature of your trip, you get different trip modes. So this may raise some community concerns that some customers may prefer a non-dedicated service versus a dedicated service, or the vice versa, as Tara highlighted on her presentation, that there's really different groups inside this paratransit groups. So options will not be equally valued by these customers. So in this study here at the MBTA, the suburb customers received around 13% of the NDSP service, while core customers only received around 5%. So the next step was to see if we could use algorithm fairness to solve the spatial distribution problem. So really looking at technology here to allow us to leveraging technology to solve a really hard problem. And the answer is yes, we can rebalance the algorithm to achieve not only optimal efficiency, but also an equity distribution of the trips around this. So then a big question raised is how much it would cost to deliver an equitable service in an entire MBTA area. So the first important element that I want to highlight here is the opt-in rate. So we need an opt-in rate of over 50% to really achieve that spatial equity that we're planning here. Below that, like, you can get closer, you can get better, but that's just not enough trips to be changed around. Also, in addition, so the other factor there is an additional cost. There is an additional cost for providing the equity service that varies for the MBTA scenario, in this case, between 1.5 and 3.5 to provide a more equitable service. So there is a trade-off that belongs to every operator or every transit agency and every community to make a decision of, like, do you want to spend a little bit more, or do you want to drive directly from efficiency? So that's really for the operator to decide. So my final message here is that efficient intermodal algorithms can deliver not only efficiency, but also help solve some of the mobility and equity challenge in what we see from paratransit and human service transportation. We need modern and fair algorithms that can do so, and that's the core of dynamic ideas. So with that, I'll thank you very much, and I'll turn it back to Diane there.
Thank you, Diogo. So our last speaker before we open up for questions is Anthony Shannon. And Anthony is the co-founder of MUVE, a technology mobility venture focused on universal design and accessibility, working with governments, transit and paratransit agencies, as well as community organizations to empower those living with disabilities and their extended families. His company has built and deployed mobility and social inclusion products, which include fully integrated dispatch and ride hailing, built from the ground up to help those who need it most to access a better service level. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you so much, Diane, and thank you, Samsi, for having us again. Great pleasure to be here with everyone. And yeah, so MOVE essentially stands for My Universal Vision for Everyone. And it was started a couple of years ago by my co-founder and I, and we really looked at paratransit, accessible transportation from a technology lens, and tried to say what type of solutions could we propose to implement a better solution that works at the intersection of dispatch and ride hailing. So in essence, what we try to do is aggregate as many accessible providers as possible, whether it's private, public, paratransit, as well as subsidized, in one view, making it easier for consumers to choose their best option and go from there. So our idea is to aggregate as many assisted, wheelchair accessible, paratransit. So for that, we work with drivers to try and recruit drivers that want to follow the accessibility training and join the platform. But we also work with transit agencies, and we work directly with governments to empower them with the tools and the dispatch platform so that they can organize their paratransit in a more efficient way. Of course, a huge part of what we do now is to collaborate and work at the intersection of technology, government, and community. So we have partnerships with some of the most awesome nonprofits, community organizations like ALS Society, and we really try to collaborate to propose a solution that works, but that's also inclusive for everyone. So I'll walk you through the application here. So this is the consumer app, the rider app. So as people sign in, they can sign up as themselves or as a caregiver signing up on behalf of someone else. As they create their profile, they can tag which type of accessibility need. We've integrated voice, color contrasting, and went really far in our thinking in terms of what can we do to bring some universal design principles to our solutions. So as a ride-hailing solution, it looks similar to various TNCs. One thing that makes it a bit unique is that we can add passengers, family members, and friends to the application and easily book on behalf of someone else if they don't have the capabilities to do it themselves. We also aggregate and bring as many activities as possible together, whether it's food and drink, sports, entertainment, and learning. And the idea behind this is really to build and foster the sense of community. And yes, offer all the dispatch, transportation, and mobility tools, but also allow that people to be able to experience a better interaction within their communities. One of the most awesome things that our team has been working on, and it's something that we plan on growing in the future, is really looking at accessibility mapping and pinning as a module and as a community development platform of itself. So in essence, you can tag a business, a location, a school, a library, and you can add a lot more information around, okay, the entrance is accessible, washroom, parking. It can go pretty precise all the way to lights, intersections. And so this is something we really plan on growing and doing a whole lot more research and development into. All right, can you guys see the slides now?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, great. So in essence, here's our story. We started the company in 2017, so we're fairly new, but we were able to advance fairly quickly. In 2018, we have a very special
No,
and
Anthony, we're not seeing your slides, I don't think. No.
Oh, okay.
There you go. Yeah.
All right. Awesome. So beautiful. Okay, so in 2018, we were blessed to win Mobility Startup to Watch at SUMC, I think in their first ever startup challenge. And since then, we were able to get on the map of a couple DOTs and states and various governments that we're now working with. One of those is Michigan Department of Transportation. We also were awarded a participation with the City Tech Collaborative, which is something we look forward to fostering and building upon in Chicago. And we're currently in the process of launching and deploying and scaling our solutions in the USA and in Canada. So what we try to do is bring in as many sources of vehicles as possible through our software. So whether it's paratransit, buses, converted minivans, and sedans, you guys saw the applications. So essentially it's transportation, community, remapping for accessibility, At the core, we really focus on pooling, scheduling, and driver efficiencies. As a lot of my fellow panelists mentioned today, that seems to be one of the core areas that Paratransit can really have improvements in the future. And that's what we try to focus on, trying to aggregate as much of the data as possible, analyze it, and propose better routing so that there's as least amount of deadheading as possible. So this is our dispatch and transit platform. There's real-time admin and analytics around it. There's a multi-level admin and dispatch. And we've developed some traffic control systems that's all proprietary that we have deployed now, which essentially looks at all the data that we've compiled and tries to anticipate different types of dispatch issues that dispatch offices could be focused on at the transit or operator level. For example, a driver might be in front of a passenger's door for more than 10 minutes, and that delays the whole schedule for everyone else. So trying to anticipate some of these issues and flagging them as soon as they happen so that we can have a system that's truly efficient. The ability to add user-specific needs in profile creation, so accessibility, veterans, any type of accessibility need. We have a whole reporting module. We also do partnerships with academia, which is something we look forward to scaling up in the future. We are based in Montreal and Canada, and so we did a partnership with a university called McGill University, where as a part of a Managing for Impact and Sustainability class, we were able to partner with a group of students to do community involvement, impact initiatives, and some research and data. So as a part of this, a lot of students kind of came together and focused on tagging and pinning various locations around the campus, all the buildings that are either accessible or not accessible so that students can navigate the campus in a better area and have a better experience. So everything from volunteering and student sensitivity awareness and a lot of research around accessibility, paratransit, smart city projects that are happening globally to try to inspire us as to what the next wave of mobility and solutions might be. So some of the keys to success that we've seen and that we strive for in the partnerships that we have and in the projects that we deploy, a human-centered design, trying to build a fully customized solution. So we don't just send our technology and that's it, that's all. We really come in and try to anticipate and learn from what the local needs are in that community, what the capabilities are and where they might want to go. And then our research and development and innovation team really builds that in and proposes a fully customized solution. We obviously need willing partners, so nonprofits, transit, DOTs, governments, and community. And we've talked about this earlier in the session, but integration with existing services, assets, and partners, that's a core part of our approach. And just build a mutually actionable roadmap to scaling the initiative once those steps are complete. So a rollout strategy for us with a new transit property or an operator or a DOT really looks in like 3 phases. So the first phase being identifying the strategic partners, doing a needs assessment and a deployment plan and strategy. The second phase is to deploy and to test and iterate. And the third phase is to scale up what works and essentially rinse and repeat. So some of the key partnerships: government, community, corporations for sponsorships, and academia. So thank you very much. Here's my email, anthony@GoMove. Feel free to drop me a note if you'd like to chat further, and very grateful for this opportunity. Thank you, everyone, and I'll be looking forward to questions.
Thank you, Anthony. So we have about 20 minutes left in our session, and this is going to be our time for Q&A, and I believe questions have been coming in during the presentations, and I think I have someone from SUMC who's been receiving them. So
yeah, so the first question came during Roger's presentation. Grace asked, what's the optimal cost efficiency, break even or something else? Roger, you're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, well, nothing's break even in public transportation, that's for sure. I think that the benchmark for ADA paratransit services should be something along the lines of what the cost per mile would be for a service delivered by a taxi or a TNC. That doesn't mean that you aren't going to have dedicated vehicle services that will be more expensive than that. But I think that if you have this option, then there has to be strong consideration given to it. Now, having said that, what the Tara's, what Tara was reporting from the feedback from users, I think is also important, that there are people who would, for whatever reason, would prefer to stick with a service that has a lower level of service from a customer perspective, but is more comforting, more familiar, et cetera. So you're always going to have some potentially significant portion of your ridership that's going to do that. But the numbers that Anthony showed for the MBTA are eerily similar to the numbers in the city of Chicago for its taxi access program, which is a consumer choice program. I think it's like $17 a trip, whereas the regular ADA service is in the high 30s. So there's a big difference between these two numbers. And yes, some of it is caused by the fact that oftentimes the non-dedicated vehicle trips are shorter, but you can normalize for that. There is still a very substantial difference. And I think this should be what our system should be trying to do, is to drive downwards towards the cost that would be achieved if they just had every trip taken by taxi or TNC.
Yeah, I think if I could add something to that, I think Roger mentioned it really well, and I think I would add, just from our experience, every community and even the geography of the cities are different. The nature of the cities are different, or of the trips are different. So you're going to see the variance by natural factors in those communities. So you really have to benchmark, not by only, I even shared in my presentation the blended average cost per trip. That's now one metric that we are watching because the pilot is growing, but there needs to be other metrics there that we would kind of normalize so that you can achieve some of this rating if the service is good or not. So I think that's only my caveat to that. That's like every location, it's going to have its unique set of metrics there.
Okay. So an anonymous person asked if there are any recommendations for funding sources to study or implement technology-driven improvements for ADA or HST systems. Tara said you'd jump on this one.
Yeah, I can take an initial stab, and probably other panelists have some thoughts as well. A couple of things I can offer. One is, I think, just an overarching perspective that from the federal, this type of experimentation and operational dollars, there are specialized programs, funding programs that have some eligibility for thinking about technology innovation in your paratransit system. And one example of that is the recently announced, I was just looking it up, it's called the AIM grant, which stands for Accelerating Innovative Mobility. From FTA, there's a notice of funding opportunity out right now. That's one opportunity. But the other thing that I would offer is, in our sort of national landscape study of partnerships between transit and TNCs, we asked everybody what was the funding source that they were relying on for those pilots, and it is by and large local and quite a creative mix of funding sources, but really all coming from local revenue sources. So I think it requires some creativity right now, and when Diane asked us to think about the paths forward, how do we actually realize some of the change and take advantage of the real advancements in technology that all three of the other panelists have outlined, the key question, one of the key questions for me is that funding piece. So really good question.
Well, I also think it's a good question because it seems like, ironically enough, there's the money is more available to do something that might not work than it is to do a study that would help set the parameters of what, you know, what is most likely to work. We've been very fortunate working with the transit agency in Nashville and now with the RTA in Chicago, who had some money to be able to look at these things, but it seems like a lot of services have been put out there with relatively minimal planning analysis type of precursors to it. And I think there's a need for some substantial research and analysis capabilities, the sort of things that Diago is talking about in, you know, that's of interest in Boston, the trade-offs between, you know, different things. And again, we're seeing the same thing with our clients in Nashville and Chicago, that there's multiple objectives at work here, and the lowest cost solution is not the only objective. And we have a hard enough time trying to figure out which might even be the lowest cost solution given the wide diversity of circumstances. So to look at the you know, additional perspectives, that's, you know, even in a $250,000 study, that's very hard to do. So I would like to see the federal government or someone put some real money into understanding this, because going back to my original point, we have agencies spending 15, 18, 20% of their budget on something that's carrying 2% of their trips. And there has to be a better way to do this, but we're all flying blind a little bit.
Okay.
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, on that perspective, just coming from, you know, from Canada, essentially, there's sources from multiple countries that we're looking at. And the one thing I'll add, I agree with everyone. There's certainly different levels of government that we can solicit, whether it's federal or local. But I've seen personally from our experience, a lot of willingness to go even fund these international and cross-border initiatives. And that's been something that we find is encouraging. So in your seek for funding, maybe one thing that I would say is not necessarily limiting it to local, looking at other sources of funding and seeing if maybe you can participate in other types of projects.
Anthony, we also had another question directed at you about clients requesting specific providers. If a client requests a trip on your app, do they choose the provider, or does the app select find the most appropriate provider?
So, I mean, it kind of does both. It aggregates all the options and suggests whichever one might be cheapest and fastest. If you're applicable to, you know, if you're signed up to Paratransit, for example, your profile is all synced up with your accessibility in the Paratransit to make sure you can get the subsidized rides. But there's two ways that people can get rides. One is they can call their transit agency, as they typically do, and the transit agency will input the trip in our dispatcher on web. And the other way is through the app. They can simply select which option works best for them, and it is integrated with their existing profile for Paratransit, and it has to go through that same process for every user if they want to get the subsidized ride.
That's great. Now in the chat, Roger, someone asked you to elaborate a little bit more about the transactional data specification and how it could be used to bring multiple providers under a single platform.
Yeah, we Diane was the program manager for that project, which just was finished several months ago, and we developed a recommended data specification for demand responsive transportation services, which would permit different operators different software systems that operators use to interoperate. Obviously, something like that doesn't have to be our recommendation, but some sort of universal language, so to speak, that all of us can use to be able to share, you know, resources is very important to make this business as usual, because otherwise one is building these systems on a case-by-case basis. Well, maybe we get Lyft in this city to interoperate with brand X software, but you know, another city we have brand Y software and Uber, or brand Y software and, you know, a taxi dispatch system, of which there's 2 or 3 leading ones now. And if they have no way to easily talk to one another, then that becomes a significant barrier to using the same, using platforms interchangeably. So that's really, that's where the payoff from these data specification come, is that when you pull together these resources like, you know, like the MBTA is hoping to do, or again in Chicago and Nashville, where we'd like to have the providers to be able to interoperate with some central system rather than the sort of do it all on a sort of an ad hoc basis. That's where I see these things becoming extremely useful, because then somebody like Anthony and MUVE, if multiple people are using their services, but then they can interoperate with a variety of different operators, and they don't have to build all these interfaces themselves, which is expensive, time consuming, and people aren't necessarily going to even pay for it.
So this report that Roger's speaking of was actually, it's been out for several months now, is a preliminary report, but the report was actually released yesterday as TCRP report 210, and it is downloadable for free. And I believe, Roger, it also includes specifications that you prepared as part of the research. So that is also available with the product.
Right, there actually are specifications there in a suggested way if people wanted to use those specifications as to how these different messages could be validated. So again, I think we need a more industry-wide focus to be able to try to implement either these specifications or something similar to them, but there actually are tools in this report that one could use to do something on a regional or statewide basis.
So Elliot asked about a specific feed specification, GTFS Flex. I wanted to know your thoughts on that as the data standard.
Well, GTFS Flex is a very useful addition to the GTFS standard, because it enables us to describe demand responsive services. But this is what we call discovery information, the GTFS Flex. It helps you discover what a service is. You can't transact with the GTFS Flex. It just tells you that in, say, Amesbury, which is part of the, I think, the MBTA service area, there is a demand responsive service there, and here's the shape of the service, and it has 3 vehicles, and it operates from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. I mean, that's what GTFS Flex is for, and it's great. It's wonderful, because we've never had this information before, but that doesn't enable you to actually get a ride on that service. It just tells you there's something there, and good luck.
All right. Judy asked about, this is more broad to the panel, about education for paratransit services. Are any of you working with schools, human service organizations, and transit agencies to educate riders or caregivers on the benefits or advantages of using non-dedicated paratransit modes?
I'm happy to tackle a portion of that and pass it along, but we certainly do that in our project in Michigan, especially on the rider side, with seniors that may have a phone, may not know necessarily how to download a new app, and that is one of the things that we focus on, is trying to educate people on how to use the products. So we did focus groups, bringing people in the community together at the transit agencies and walking people through the app, and in those local, more rural communities, word of mouth hopefully can be helpful in allowing people to do that. And when they do it once or twice, they feel much more comfortable doing it. So that's something that we've done on the mobile app side with the users, and there's a huge amount of training that goes into supporting and trying to enhance and innovate with dispatch offices and transit agencies alike. A lot of them, maybe not in the COVID crisis, but in general, business are extremely busy. They're handling calls all the time, and it's they need tools to be able to enhance those, but they also need the training to be able to know, okay, how to use this technology to the best of their capabilities to enhance their operation. So there's training on the user and on the operator side.
So if I could take the moderator's prerogative to maybe have the final question, possibly focusing to Diogo. So how did you roll it out? When you started the MBTA program, how did you roll it out to the public so they would be aware of it, they would be willing, they would be able, and then maybe Anthony can, similarly in rural Michigan, which is a completely different environment, how did you do the rollout?
I think from our perspective, it starts, and I think Tara's presentation mentioned a little bit of that, as an experiment. Like when we started back in 2016, we don't even knew if people would actually go and use Uber and Lyft. We don't know. Like people were saying to us, no, they're never going to use it. They're never going to use it. And we said, okay, we got to at least try. Let's put it out there. And then there was a small group. That was one point that we learned across. We didn't do a lot of marketing because we didn't know what we're going to get. It was just word of mouth, as Anthony mentioned, and it picked it up. We had 200 on Uber, 200 customers on Uber, 200 customers on Lyft to start back in 2016, and that'll fill it up in a month. So just by word of mouth. And after that, most of the growth, like transit agencies don't do a good job on marketing and all of this overall. So that's like, for us, most of this growth that I displayed on the presentation came up from word of mouth and people just willing a better service. I think that's what it's driving a lot of this, is really customers willing a better service. As Roger mentioned and Tara mentioned, is it going to be for everyone? No, there is a segment of the paratransit customer that needs a different type of service or something, but there is a possibility here to serve the overall population better. But I would say that it's really starting into the funding question that we had before. This started with almost no funding. It was like the savings from the program funds itself. So that's the way it started. So starting some of these things can cost almost close to no money. I would say no cost, but like with a very low budget, you can start some of these things and get it going.
Thanks, I appreciate that. From our perspective, our rollout, I mean, one of the best things that we did in our proposal initially for MDOT was to build in this assessment period. When we were awarded, we didn't really have a clear understanding of the full operational landscape, the tools being used, how happy the operators were with the current tools, and what could be done to just propose a better solution in that community. So we really took that 90-day, I believe it was a 90-day assessment period, to learn what the needs were, and then retweak our proposal to say, okay, now that we know what they have and what they want, what the community has and what they don't have, and what we can do to actually build and deploy something, that's what we use as a really agile approach to look at the problems in real time and taking back to our innovations team to say, what can we build in this time? What can we tweak? Can we integrate in the systems that existed there? In rural Michigan, as it turns out, we could not integrate with the existing system. So we had to actually build a lot of these capabilities and do it in partnership with our operators and transit agencies. So there's pros and cons to doing everything. Obviously, that's a huge undertaking, as Diogo mentioned, to build all this technology and to deploy it. But our rollout has been phased in a way where we wanted our operators to feel comfortable with the technology before rolling out the ride-hailing solution. And that's also a great solution, so that they really, ultimately, the operators and the transit agencies are the one running the paratransit in our market. So making sure that they're comfortable with the tools first, and then rolling out the community-facing tools alongside it. So that was our approach.
Thank you. So Pete, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, I mean, it's 4:18. We were only allotted till 4:15.
I'll ask one more question anyway. So here's a topic we haven't talked about at all, and it's for Tara, and that is regarding regulation. So what is the regulatory landscape that relates to enabling innovation or not enabling innovation in paratransit? Could you touch on that briefly? Because that's an important topic that just hasn't come up this session.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Diane. I think this conversation has been largely focused on innovation on the technology side, and a realistic, taking the perspective of someone sitting in the transit agency's seat, there are existing structures in place that have sort of forced the current situation, forced the problem statement as Roger described it at the beginning, which is another necessary component of the path forward. So I think that, FTA has done a great job offering some guidance starting a few years ago when the shared use mobility industry came online, and there started to be interest from transit agencies to partner and leverage those services differently. And I think since then, it's continued to be a back and forth, and the funding programs we've seen federally, from the Mobility on Demand Sandbox program to more recently the IMI grants, Innovative Mobility Initiative, and then the AIM grants that I just recognized. All of these are part of FTA's process for thinking through what could a new regulatory landscape look like. So I think with those initiatives already in place and the current situation, as I mentioned, sort of forcing experimentation within the industry, I think that there's probably change coming, but as we all know, I think it's one of the slowest pieces to move, and the technology partners are probably going to continue moving a lot faster than the regulatory landscape.
Okay, thank you, Tara. So we have run over a bit, and I want to thank, first of all, the presenters, each of you, for great presentations, and for our audience for attending this session, which, as I mentioned, all of the presentations will be available. And I believe every session you attended and every session you missed will be recorded, and I believe you can get access to that as well. So thank you again, and have a nice evening.